To students in the Global Law Workshop and to our visitors, welcome. I'm Professor DeMott. It's my pleasure to introduce Peter Gourevitch. First, though, I'll make an announcement that Professor Kelly has asked us to make. The Duke University Center on International Studies sponsors the university seminar on global governance and democracy. We'll have a seminar tomorrow, Thursday, from 5:30 to 7 on, the title is The Politics of Borrowing and Non-Borrowing Among International Courts. So of particular interest to those interested in international law and courts, and particularly here obviously international courts as institutions. The location is the Jonathan Franklin Center on Irwin Road, again from 5:30 to 7:30. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to have Professor Gourevitch here today and to have his paper. He's a political scientist, I would say by both training and inclination, and instinct.
Absolutely, all of the above, and more.
All of the above. He's been a professor at the University of California at San Diego and was the founding dean of the School of International Relations at UCSD. He's published and written about many things. His work first came to my attention through an essay that he was commissioned to do for the Yale Law Journal, which was a political scientist's look at corporate governance scholarship, predominantly legal corporate governance scholarship. He's written extensively about corporate governance. Has a quite distinctive commitment to the view that corporate governance is, and its evolution over time, is not isolated from politics, which is a shocking thought to some legal scholars, but in fact does seem to quite fairly descriptive of the world. So today, Professor Gourevitch's paper is not as directly about private sector corporate governance as some of the other papers in the series, but it's quite clearly related to it in some very interesting ways. So he will talk for about half an hour or so, and then we'll have questions. As this is a course for credit for students in the Global Law Workshop, I will of course recognize and I'm very eager to have any questions or comments from students in the workshop, and certainly from others as well. So, Peter.
Well, thank you very much, and it really is a pleasure to be here. I know lots of people at Duke over the years. I've come here and always had a wonderful time and found it very stimulating and interesting place. And my experience with the Yale Law Journal was very fascinating when I was sharing it with you that interacting with a law journal is it's so different from the kind of thing that disciplinary journals do, that how law reviews work, and that was a very fascinating experience for me. But I also have enjoyed enormously, because of my interest in corporate governance. I have spent a lot of time reading law journals and found that a lot of very fascinating things in there. So what I'd like to do actually is do a couple things at the very beginning on corporate governance. And so your workshop has been about corporate governance. Let me make just a couple things to bring out a little bit more sharply how my concern with these NGOs really is very directly tied to my interest in corporate governance. This developed because of my interest in corporate governance. This has become the problems of confidence that I've become interested in. There's a variety of issues that have arrived in what we might call areas of consumption, aspects about the goods that we care about how they're made, that have arisen. Wild salmon versus, I'm fascinated by a story in New York that fancy New York grocery stores that were selling high-grade stuff to fancy consumers, somebody bought the wild salmon advertised as wild salmon and tested it and discovered that well over half of it was not wild. So these stores, the brand name of these stores somehow was not protecting them from misrepresenting what they were selling. You've all heard the stories about toys from China. Are the toys safe? Medicines containing various things. There are interesting issues like soccer balls being made. Child labor issues have been out there, the consumption, or I love farmers markets. We were talking about your farmers markets. I love farmers markets, and I go to them, and I'm always asking them in the farmers market, is your stuff organic? And they say, well, no, but it's pesticide free. And then I buy it, and then I walk away leaving. Why do I believe what they're saying? Well, I have no idea whether it actually is pesticide free or organic. So these questions about how we have confidence in these various aspects of products interests me. But it arose out of questions that I have. So there are a lot of NGOs that are out there trying to monitor these things. A lot of things we read, a lot of things about no child labor on this, or this is organic, or it's locally grown, or it's pesticide free. And I became more and more interested in why do we have confidence in these? Why do we have confidence in the NGOs that claim these? And this arose because this is very similar to problems that I was noticing in the corporate governance field. Because in the corporate governance field, there was a tremendous amount of the emphasis, a lot of the theoretical emphasis on corporate governance field has been, here's the shareholders and here's the managers and the board of directory, and there's a whole bunch of agency problems, and how do we solve those? And so there are a lot of issues come out in corporate securities law. How do we have laws and regulation that specify the power of each of those, and kind of an idea that the more well-developed those are, the more protections there are for the shareholders, the more confidence we can have that the shareholders are able to monitor what the managers are up to. And so a lot of the debate, the regulatory debate in that field has been about the quality of shareholder protection, the regulatory world in corporate governance, and then in securities regulation and all that. And it seems to me what's missing from that is something that we now know is missing. There's certainly an awareness of that, but I think it was not a very central part of the preoccupations. There's a whole lot of things that we're expecting, at least in the Anglo-American model of this. We're expecting a whole lot of reputational intermediaries to be doing a whole lot of things that we're assuming, and a lot of this literature assumes that they're doing it correctly, and that therefore the shareholders, the investment, all the players in this game use that information to evaluate. One of the big sanctions against managers is a hostile to managers are doing badly, the value of the shares go down, somebody buys a lot of those shares, and engineers a hostile takeover, and that the managers kind of are presumably afraid of that, they'll lose their jobs. So one of the powerful incentives on the managers is going to be that. Well, a lot of that then has to do with what affects the values of the shares, and all these things are going to affect that. So the bond rating agencies are very much in the news these days because of the mortgage stuff. We all know that they're being questioned, but all these intermediary players have been, I think in the older literature, assumed that these reputational intermediaries were assumed to be playing the role that is assigned to them, without looking, I think, sufficiently carefully whether they actually do, or what was it about their structure that actually makes them do that. So as I thought about why do we have confidence or lack of confidence in these various reputational intermediaries, well, now we know a lot of the things have come out, that there are the ones that we are more worried about is when they have a conflict of interest between this function that they're playing to investors and their own interests as firms. Does that create some tension at what they do? Are they really likely to do it? If the bond rating agencies really have an incentive to be effective at rating the bonds, when actually they pay no penalty whatsoever for not being effective. They are being paid, as we know, by the corporation that has to issue the bond. It wants that bond to get a AAA rating because only AAA bonds can be in certain kind of portfolios. So there's a collusion in there. And so we have a low confidence in the bond rating agencies because we see an extraordinary conflict of interest. And I think this idea, this is not a surprise to any of you. It's been much discussed, but it seems to me not sufficiently recognized in literature. And we can go through the same thing with accounting firms and the incentive the accounting firms have. The accounting firms have an incentive many of them are making more money as consultants than they are issuing the audit. So are they really going to be aggressive in their auditing to a firm where the CEO actually gets to decide whether to hire them or not to be a consultant? The same thing, compensation experts are ludicrous in their lack of an incentive to do anything because they're paid to give good advice. So we know, we see these problems, they run through the system. So I think that is, so I got interested in that. I was going to give you pet solution to the collective action problem, but in the interest of time. My collective solution to the collective action problem of the American system is to empower institutional investors to be able to play a more active role. And there's a regulation that's in front of been in front of the SEC for the past 10 years, Rule 14A-8, which would empower institutional investors to put items on a proxy ballot or nominate directors for shareholding. And this has been slapped down by Cox and his predecessor. Donaldson tried to push this forward, was forced out. And I saw in the New York Times article did you see this article 2 days ago about the new commissioner, the SEC commissioner, Shapiro, is that her name? And there was a hint in there that she might bring this back. So I've been fascinated by this, tracking this one. The politics of why this comes for, as Professor DeMott said, I'm interested in politics. So I perceive that rulemaking is a result of politics, because whether that rule is going to come out or down is extraordinarily connected to whether the Republicans or the Democrats have an influence in Congress and who gets appointed to the SEC. It fascinates me in comparative basis because it is something that the British institutional investors have. And your previous speaker, Professor Black, was in the 90s somebody who paid a lot of attention to this. He wrote some very interesting articles. I think Black and Coffey, as I recall, wrote some articles on this point. So this is an idea that's been out in the law circles on this for a while, but it's been one of the fascinating things to me on this was that here's two common law. You all know this common civil law debate about what kind of corporate governance regulation exists in countries, an argument I'm very dubious about. So I like the examples where common law countries differ, and this is one where the common law countries differ because the UK has much more aggressive rules on empowering institutional investors than the United States does. And so Black and Coffey have been interested in this. They wrote about it. And this idea has been around, but it's been politics has shaped whether or not this thing gets any currency. So that is one of the many things in the regulatory world that's out there to me to watch is how are institutional investors different, which ones of them have an incentive to be more proactive, and what can be done to empower shareholders to pay more, to be able to pay, not only to pay more attention, but they have to incentivize them to pay more attention by giving them some. It has to make a difference. If their activism can have no effect, why will they be more active? So I got interested in that, but that's not our topic today. In my interest in this topic of the NGOs became because I got being more and more interested in these intermediaries between the shareholders and the firm, were a whole bunch of people offering information. Okay, a whole lot of agents giving the principals information that they were presumably were interested in. So I became interested in the quality of that information. And I found at the same time that my students were asking me lots and lots of questions about corporate social responsibility. And so I would discuss with them, well, when I'm interested in fiduciary responsibility, not corporate social responsibility, but they kept wanting to know, so I became more interested in it. And I became more interested in these sets of issues about ethical consumption, a bunch of characteristics about a product which have to do with the way it's made rather than the product itself. And how do we figure out how do we get information upon that has some value? So I say ethical consumption because this isn't about the quality of the shirt. I am not very good at this, but I know there are people like my lady friend. She can look at a shirt and tell immediately whether it's any good in terms of how well it was made. I ask her, what are you looking at? Well, looking at the stitching. Are the seams straight? Now, isn't that interesting? I don't look at that. But I'm interested in a variety of things where you cannot look at the product itself and know. You do not know by looking at the tomato whether it's organic. You do not I cannot tell by looking at the shirt whether children were involved in making it or whether there were harsh labor conditions in the making of it. So there's a variety of these areas that are really quite interesting, and so I become interested in, well, how do we evaluate that? Now, so these are also areas where these are often areas where there's not a lot of government regulation. One solution to the regulation problem is, well, have government regulations and have good enforcers. Well, we could discuss whether the enforcers are good. Do you have confidence in the FDA? The people who are certifying that this drug is safe, we can discuss that, but we know that structure. That's a familiar structure because we have a literature on that. So these are areas where we don't have, a lot of these ethical consumption issues are ones where we don't have very much regulation at the national or at the international level. And anyways, the NGOs don't believe in government regulation. They think government's captured, right? They don't believe that the regulators, forget the regulators, they're all captured. We can't have confidence in them. And they also don't have confidence in the private sector. They say, well, why should you believe in a private regulator self-monitoring? Because they have an incentive to tell you, they want to shine you on and tell you that what they do is wonderful, but they have a profit motive. They're trying to make a profit, so they're going to skimp on their standards and skimp on the monitoring and do it cheaply, not do a good job. So we can't trust the private sector either, and they offer themselves. There's a lot of NGOs out there that are offering a standard, whatever the issue area is that you're concerned about. They offer a standard, and then they say, we're going to have this standard, and we're going to monitor it. We're going to give out information. We're going to look at corporations, and we're going to give out information about this or that product or whether it meets that standard. So that raises to me then the question of, well, what makes them reliable in their ability to do that? And so I think we should be asking the same question of the NGOs that we ask of the people that they criticize. And it's the same, to me, analytically, the same set of issues about the bond rating agencies. It's the same problem. Why do we have or not have confidence in the bond rating agencies? It's the same problem. Or election monitors or any of these people. It's the same question. What is it about their incentive system that gives them an incentive to do a good job? And another way to put it is, what are the costs of being wrong? These are forms of speech. What are the costs of having bad speech? And if we kind of ask a whole bunch of questions about their incentives, it seems to me we can learn a lot about that. So I become interested in that, trying to think through these different forms of monitoring. And I want to my project is to locate it, to say, well, we have these different issue areas which also involve monitoring. You're interested in art dealers and things like that. We just talked about this. That's another interest. So the whole lot of art dealers, arms control, water purification. In California, we're very concerned about, there's different kinds, not just water, there are many kinds of waters. That the water that you drink, that the water that you can spray on the golf courses, the water that you can put on farms, these are different kinds of water. So there's, how do we monitor, who's monitoring these different kinds of water? These strike me as all kind of a related family. And so I'm trying to think through what is it about, what's special about NGOs, and what is it about the characteristics of an NGO that could give us higher or lower confidence in what they do. And so these are some of the kind of inferring from the stuff that we've been doing on bond rating agencies and other things, is that we can see some characteristics. Weak autonomy from the target of the monitoring. What are the incentives to monitor? What are the costs of being wrong? What are some of the governance characteristics? What are the skills and capacity? So these are inferred. This is not the only deduction that I'm making, has to do with trying to think through that if we think in incentives and we think that there's a cost to being wrong, if there's no cost to being wrong, then we're in trouble, right? We have some reason to be concerned about their ability to do a good job. So if we think about the different costs to being wrong, we can sort through these different characteristics and see how they could have a bearing on that. So let's go into some of let me just give you a few examples, and then we can switch and talk about your questions. So the question about private bonding, that the market won't work, private bonding won't work. I think this is an interesting complaint from the NGO side. It's kind of a complaint that the private sector can't be trusted. And I'm a believer in regulation, but I think we should take seriously that there are some solutions to private sector involvement in here, and I think that's kind of the insight of the market for lemons. We can identify ways in which a private organization can pay a very high cost to being wrong, and if that's the case, we might have confidence in monitoring them. This is the Chicago School Against Regulation, and I can complain about it, but there's something in it about it, and I think the famous Market for Lemons paper of Akerlof was a good example of that. If a used car dealer puts a guarantee on his used car, or her used car, that used car dealer is going to pay a price for being wrong, which is that he or she will have to fix the car, and that gives you a signal that that used car dealer stands behind the value, the integrity of the car, and so that gives you confidence, and that helps develop a used car market. And you don't need regulation to do that, although it is interesting to me that states actually pass lemon laws, which you guys can discuss. Why do you need a lemon law if, in fact, this private bonding is supposed to work so well? But But that is one way to think of it. So it's the size of the bond gives us confidence. It's the cost of getting wrong. The bigger the cost of being wrong, that's the size of the bond. And big bonds give us confidence. Of course, you're going to pay more for it, right? Your car, you're not going to have to pay for that warranty. But that is the price that you have to pay for accuracy. That's you, the consumer. So it's double-edged. The provider has to pay a cost, but you, the consumer, if you really want that characteristic, if you want that to be child-free, and you want a verification that it is, that's going to cost you something. And so you have to be willing to pay the cost of that. So that leads down a lot of interesting comparisons in this issue area, that they're not, the nature of the consumer, the nature of the principal who wants this differs a lot. Their willingness to pay for this. One fascinating thing to me is that people who buy Patagonia clothes are different from the consumers at Walmart, and the consumers at Walmart may not be willing to pay the price. So getting Walmart to conform to these is very different from getting stores to conform like Patagonia, where the consumers will boycott them. So I became interested in organizations like that. There are organizations like that. Underwriters Laboratory is one example. Consumer Reports is another one. Underwriters Laboratory is the UL that you have on your electrical thing. And that has tremendous, I started thinking to myself, what has high credibility out there? Well, UL has pretty high credibility. What is it about UL that gives it such high credibility? Is that, well, UL is totally autonomous from the items, from the target of its monitoring. I'm very fascinated, if you look on the websites of all these NGOs, they heavily advertise that they're non-governmental and non-profit. That's why I set this up. This is a recurrent trope in their stuff. And we're thinking, what are they trying to tell us by saying that? So they have no target on their board of directors. If you look through who controls them, how do we figure out how would we identify independence in the target of monitoring? Well, one is to look at the board of directors, who's on it, who controls them. And that's an interesting thing about being nonprofit. Presumably, I asked myself, what if they were a profit-making firm? What if UL were a profit-making firm and had shares that we could buy? Well, presumably, that might make them vulnerable to takeover by the people that they're trying to monitor if their shares were freely available on the market. But it raises the question, how can I tell that they're autonomous? Can I tell by looking at the board of directors? Not so easy. I might have to know more. How do I know that that particular person isn't actually a major shareholder in something else? I don't. But a lot of this, I think, is a matter of looking at the board of directors. They don't make money from the, they do the testing themselves, and they don't rely on other kinds of information from the testing. One of the things that fascinates me, maybe you could help me on this, is what is the cost, if something is wrong, can they be sued? If I buy a toaster and the toaster bursts into flames, how does Underwriters Laboratory escape the legal liability from that? If they've put their label on that toaster, why are they free from that? Presumably they say that they have engaged in the proper process. They engaged in all of the testing, and they're publishing the information on their testing. And unless you can show them that show that the testing was doing wrong, they have not violated what they're actually saying. And that's a very interesting one, because one of the things that fascinates me in NGO monitoring is a lot of NGO monitoring that I'm discovering is process tracing. In other words, they don't really know, it's handoff, you know? This fish, if I've been looking at fisheries, what they're really certifying is that I got that fish from Judith, who got it from Professor DeMott. And if you take all that they're doing is agreeing that they got it, this is the very same fish that I got up. So it all goes back to the belief that the first fish was actually gotten from a pure ocean that was raised in sustainable ways. And if that fish entered that system, if somebody is throwing fish into the chain, and this is true in coffee, Fairtrade, a whole lot of products, if there's any cheating at that initial way, there is no way for the subsequent process to catch that. But the information that the NGOs are giving you has a lot to do with process. What they're proud of is that they give you a document, and they're training people out there. They have these specialized audit agencies, and what they're doing is they're giving you a process, an accurate process tracing account, which may be wholly accurate, but may not be telling you anything about that original fish. So why the stuff arrives in New York, which is farm raised and not wild, I don't know. That I would not be surprised if somebody's throwing into the supposed wild fish thing, somebody's throwing other things in it, and that's not being carefully monitored at that level. But I'm interested in this question of who can be sued in this whole process. And another thing about Underwriters Laboratory is that the origins of Underwriters Laboratory was the fire insurance companies created them so that fire insurance companies, when electricity began to be in all households and people began buying electric appliances, of course, they were not keen to have houses burned down and have to pay out on them. So they were very keen to reduce fires. And so there we could see a very powerful monetary incentive to contain this thing. Accuracy had a strong monetary incentive behind it. And that kind of thing, if you're incentive-oriented, gives you some confidence in it. And then they pulled out. Now, the thing is, Underwriters Laboratory is not connected to the fire insurance companies. They were the creators, but it now is this autonomous thing. So another example is Consumer Reports. Does that have credibility with you? I never spend more than $100 on any product without looking it up in Consumer Reports to see what they have to say about it. And so I asked myself, why do I believe them? Why do I believe what it says? Well, they do a lot of testing. They are paid for by subscribers. It's entirely subscriber supported. So again, there is, and you look at the corporations, organizational forms, you see really complete autonomy from the target of what they're doing. So that contrasts with some of the people in the corporate governance area where we have a low set of autonomy from the target. So in the case, Underwriters Lab, Consumer Reports, these represent interesting kind of boundary cases of things that aren't, they are whatever you call, what do you call them legally? Is Consumer Reports an NGO? Is Underwriters Lab never an NGO? I'm not sure what to call it. I think so. I don't know. Is it any different from the, Fairtrade organization? These are non-governmental, non-profit-making organizations that are set up to undertake an activity. So that, I would call them an NGO, and they have certain characteristics that increases our confidence in them. And so then let's look at some other examples. One of the most interesting ones is the labor rights area. And I picked a couple cases for you where there's some controversy within the group amongst the NGOs in and of themselves. And this is an area where I know people who've done research on this, that people kind of at a bunch of different places that are in law schools, economics department, sociology department. You can imagine there's kind of a high interest in this because labor unions are very concerned with it. Labor unions, civil rights, all kinds of people are very interested in this area. And some of the early controversies, many of you don't remember Kathy Lee Gifford or the Nike controversy, but some of us do, some of us with gray hair remember that one. And so that was one of the early controversies about this is products. Nike in the case of shoes, Kathy Lee Gifford, it was clothing. That scandal, the NGO activists, the vigilantes as the literature calls them, went out there and said, this stuff is being made in unsafe conditions, terrible conditions, bad pay, miserable conditions, child labor, women, sweatshop conditions in the third world. It's outrageous. And so this led to quite a lot of controversy, and it led to interesting debates. It's an area where the government regulation is pretty weak. The political forces that complain about this have not been strong enough to impose very strict governmental regulation. International agreements leave this out a lot. So this is an area with murky regulation, and so a lot of NGOs have moved into this and championed this as an area, and they've set up these structures, and there are two interesting organizations, the Free Labor Association, which is, and the Worker Rights Consortium, and they fight with each other. The Worker Rights Consortium says the Free Labor Association is involved in greenwashing. That is to say, it is declaring as okay a bunch of practices which it is not carefully monitoring, so that the firms get the credit with the public of complying to something, but if you look at it carefully, it's not happening. And so the Worker Rights Consortium is arguing that they're doing a bad job. So it's an interesting thing to compare them. And the interesting thing that I find in comparing them, the WRC's complaint about the FLA is that the FLA has a heavy involvement of the targets of the monitoring. If you look at the FLA board, it's tripartite. There's this phrase, multiple stakeholders. I've started, if I could do a linguistic analysis of these things, I've discovered kind of key phrases that you find even on the websites that tell you predictors of other things you're going to find when you look a little harder. When you see multiple stakeholders, you can start to predict that that means that the firms are involved in the process, that the firms, the labor people, all kinds of people, including the firms, are in it. So the problem that they're saying is, well, the firms are so heavily involved that the FLA is never able to do the kind of inspection that it would actually take to really be sure of what was happening, because in order to go do an inspection, you have to tell the firm a month ahead of time that you're coming. Well, if the firm knows that you're coming, they're going to create a Potemkin village out of it, and how do you know? And you cannot interview the workers without a representative of the firm sitting there with you, so how autonomous is that? So there's a lot of grumbling about the FLA, and the worker rights one is one where universities have been very involved. These are kind of the Association of Bookstores. I'm sure that Duke, my campus is a bookstore, your bookstore, you probably have. Why, right in this room, we may have activists who've been involved in that, because there's a lot of student involvement in using the bookstore instruments. Since students make such great consumers to mobilize and to boycott, if you can organize the bookstores and get them not to stock things that are violating these rules, you have some leverage. And so the WRC, notice it says Independent Labor Rights Monitoring Organization. And you can go through this. I do with my students. What great thing about the web, you can click their websites up and see what you can learn from it. And you can learn a remarkable amount about who's on the boards, what the rules and regulations are, what the procedures, what the processes are. And on some of them, you can even learn their financial statements, who contributes the money, where the money comes. Some of them are actually filing their tax returns for you, and others don't. So a very interesting question is, who of them are trying to be transparent on these things or which are not? And often I think it correlates with, it's a rough indicator, but it correlates with that. Well, let me, so you see the point that one striking thing at WRC FLA has to do with who's on the board and the role of the target. I think I'll quickly stop. I just want to mention Transfair and coffee, because it's a very interesting, a lot of you buy that. Coffee is an interesting one because Transfair USA and Flowcert, these organizations that are trying to certify whether this is fair trade. Fair trade is interesting because it has a lot of dimensions. The idea of fair trade that most people I think of is, I buy a pound of coffee and I see that logo on its thing. I'm presumably paying a little more for that pound of coffee, and that extra money is going to coffee producer associations. And so the question but when you study it more, there's more criteria. It's not only whether they get the money, but these are associations of small producers, producer owners. And these producer owners are supposed to be organized in cooperatives, and the cooperatives are supposed to be democratically organized to make decisions about what happens to the money. Well, that's a lot of things to monitor. Now you have to monitor not only does the money reach the target, do these little people actually benefit in some way from it, but is the money, if it goes to the producer association, is that being democratically run? How does all that work? That's pretty complicated. Is Florida democratically run? We have a hard enough time deciding that. We're not too sure. So there's an organization, Flowcert, which is a third-party organization out there which is supposed to be verifying all these things. But Flowcert is wholly independent. It's not profit, not governmental, but it's impossible to get Flowcert to actually tell you about its certification. It goes into the field and it looks at the producer cooperative in Guatemala, and you can find out whether that's actually a certified producer, but they will not give you the information on what they actually found. And if you ask them for it, which I tried to do, because what a great political philosophy and law project it would be, what conceptualization of what's sufficiently democratic does an organization like Flowcert expect of a producer association in a very poor country, of people with limited experience in speaking, reading, and all that kind of thing? What does that mean? Well, they won't tell you. They will not publish them. So this is an organization claiming to be a verifier, a third-party verifier, which will not it'll give you the formal criteria. Well, these are what we look for. But what matters is what actually happens. They will not provide that information with you. So, I still buy fair trade coffee, but I'm not sure I know what actually I'm getting from it. Well, let me stop with that. There are a lot of questions in here. I become interested in what are the things that give you confidence that on these areas of the elements of virtuous consumption of a product, the virtue elements of it, about how it was made and how it got to you, what gives you confidence in whether the thing actually meets that standard you have? I've been asking my students now for several years, I don't really want to talk about standards. You know, what's a high or low standard? Well, that's going to matter in the monitoring. I'd like you to think about why do you have confidence in them? And I've been having them write case studies, and they're posted on my website. There's about 30 of them now. If you go into my website and go under research, you will see, and they're freely downloadable. You can read them or use them, whatever you want. But they've generated these. I'm really enjoying this and hoping to try to encourage people at other places to do the same thing. And we post them. Let's get kind of more information out there. So many issue areas that the more we do that, the more we could start to learn about how these things work and how they don't work. One of the things that fascinates me when I ask my students this, you know, what do they have confidence in? I'm very quite fascinated that the store that they buy in is a bigger impact than I thought. We have something called Trader Joe's. Do you have Trader Joe's here? Trader Joe's started in Southern California, so I've been very well. It used to be only in LA, and when they opened a branch in San Diego, I said to my wife, the only reason to move to LA has just disappeared because there's now one here. So, but they believe in Trader Joe's and do not believe in any of the other supermarkets, and I'm very fascinated by why that. What is it about that? And another interesting question, and compared to that, I have many students from Asia in my class, and all the China controversy come up, and I'd ask them, well, China, you know, this is a familiar problem. The United States and the Food Agency in the late 19th century, the Europeans said that American beef and pork products were diseased, and they wouldn't import them. So one of the origins of the Food and Drug Administration, agricultural certification, is to develop a standard of certification that was reassuring for export purposes. So we had to make ourselves credible to foreign buyers to get in there. So this is so what makes that credible? Why do they believe the FDA's monitoring? So the interesting question is, China now has a credibility problem. What could China do that would reassure people? What would make you, if you were to buy medicine that would come from China, what is it that China could do? And the thing that fascinates me is that my Chinese students have zero credibility in anything. There's nothing they could do. The American students are more credible about something, what the Chinese could do. The Chinese students have low. So that's an interesting comment about governments, you know, about one of the players in this game, about what regulation can do. Well, let me stop with that and throw it open for questions, comments, and discussion.
Yeah, I have a question, and it's about the first paired example, the Underwriters Lab and Consumer Reports. You started off by talking about monitoring the sort of ethical consumption as monitoring the process and not the end products. To what extent are those two?
Well, it's monitoring how the thing was made and not whether it's quality in the sense of does it work.
But to what extent are Consumer Reports and Underwriter Labs actually providing really a benchmark largely of quality as opposed to, I mean, I don't know. You know,
well, Consumer Reports does, Underwriter Laboratories is not. I didn't mean the two of them to be a paired comparison. I wasn't pitting them against each other. It's true that I brought them up, but I was Worker Rights Consortium and FLA, and I'm interested in some comparisons, obviously, but I wasn't pitting them against each other. Well, you're right. Underwriters Laboratory isn't telling you anything about quality because they're not making quality evaluation. They're only interested in safety. Consumer Reports does offer you quality ratings, but it gives you very strong indicators of what it means by that. So included in the rating is how safe is it? How does it do what it claims to? I remember when I had to buy a refrigerator, and it said, we like this refrigerator, but we cannot give it a high rating, a best buy, because if you drop a 20-pound frozen turkey on one of the shelves from a height of 4 feet, it breaks. So I thought, well, I just have to remember never to do that. When I'm dropping turkeys, do it less than 4 feet, or buy lighter turkeys. So I went out and bought that for a refrigerator. But so they tell you what they think quality means, but they do it by testing. They provide the information.
But just to what extent? I mean, so some of what FLA and WRC does, and with the coffee monitoring, right? You're interested in how environmentally sustainable are the practices. Right. What about the labor that goes into it?
Right.
To what extent do you get that in either UL or in the Consumer Reports?
Well, you don't get it at all. They're not interested in that. That's not what they're measuring, and I don't think the Consumer Reports, unless they've changed, I don't think Consumer Reports has paid any attention to those aspects, of the social, the ethical aspects of a process.
So that's my question, which is, if you're primarily interested in questions of ethical consumption,
how
useful are these as examples?
They are useful as examples. I'm trying to set a boundary. The reason I'm doing this in bond rating agencies and all the arms control, water, I'm trying to to look at other areas of monitoring and decide why do we have confidence in them. To come up with, so I try to find non-governmental inspections, so UL, the Consumer Report, and I try to say, well, we have a lot of confidence in them. Why do we have confidence in them? What is it about them that gives confidence? If I could infer some elements of confidence in them, I could then take that idea and apply it to the ones who are interested in the ethical consumption issues. So I'm not claiming that. I'm claiming that they're not the same. Right. But I want to locate the ethical consumption in. See, a lot of the literature on NGOs that I've read is often written by people in that movement. And they say, we're special, we're different, we're not like anybody else. Because we are ethically motivated people who work for this organization, we're deeply devoted to this. We're an NGO. And we're not like the government, we're not like the corrupt profile, we're an NGO. And so therefore, why are you asking these questions? It's outrageous. Well, of course, because of our ethical, that's why I'm calling it, the market version, our ethical engagement, our high-minded concern, all that, puts us beyond these criticisms. And so I say, well, no, let's step back for a second. And that's one of the reasons that competing NGOs are interesting, because they're actually claiming a similar legitimacy. So that's the project. There's the other examples that fascinate me are, McDonald's. I have a student who did a project at McDonald's and something in Conservation International. What's McDonald's getting out of that association? Seems clear, but why is Conservation International working with McDonald's?
Okay, I've got,
Sorry,
just to have a little cue, I've got Daniel and Andrew and Professor Cox and Sue Chen and Jeff and Professor Richmond. Okay, so Daniel.
Yeah, I thought it was a very interesting article. One of the things that caught my attention was when you made reference to the fact that getting a UL label is now required in some government schools and facilities before the product can be used. I was just curious to know what sort of criteria governments pick in selecting such a monitor, and whether you think that criteria reflects some of the suggested indicators.
Well, that's a great question. I have not thought of it. I don't know anything about the process of why they pick UL as opposed to somebody else. I don't know. I mean, what is the universe of organizations of which UL is an example? And there are lots of them out there. Other of my students have written on the green building codes. And this is starting to happen. So this is a fascinating example of a similar thing. I mean, one chapter of the book I eventually like to write would be on these things where you have these organizations that are offering codes and governments start to require them. Well, how do they decide that? So you have these everybody wants green buildings. So now you've got NGOs which are creating a green building standard. Is this a green building? Are we in a green building? Probably given due. Part of it. The new part is. Are we in the new part? Oh, good, I can stay. Otherwise, I'd have to leave right away. So the new part. So you could see the motive, and the government isn't going to. So the government doesn't want to do it itself. How in the world do you want to create a whole bureaucracy to do that? Not plausible. So you've got this NGO out there. So what are the politics of getting that NGO to be believed, the Green Building Council? Why are its standards? So it's putting a label. They use, emerald, diamond, gold, whatever. They put labels on the building. How high are they conforming? And now governments say, well, we're not going to finance a building. The architect has to get a building council approve it, or else we won't pay for it. Well, man, that's a shadow of the state pretty strongly in there. That's not, that's government regulation arriving in the find. And so to me, that is something like asking bar associations to certify lawyers or medical associations to sign on doctors. These are empowering more or less non-governmental organizations with a certain authority to certify that something fits a thing. So I mean, in the specific case of UL, I don't know who the alternatives are, but I see it as fitting into this general problem. And that would be an interesting way to get after it, is to go through the legislative history of it. Find a case of a state which actually now requires UL certification, or else orphanage jails and schools can't buy it. And then how did that happen?
Andrew, you had a question.
Yeah, I thought were you going in the order of the?
No, I just sort of wrote down names in the order in which I saw them.
Okay. Yeah, I just had a question.
She's the person. She has executive authority. She has a judgment call. You have no idea what criteria she's using because she's not accountable in this particular way.
This is judgment.
This is judgment, right?
It seems like in your paper you talk a little bit about the different oversight standards, like across industries, they're going to be a little bit different, aligning the incentives. Like you give the example of the Toyota and the cross-shareholdering. For the industries such as the accounting and the rating agencies, do you have any sense of what may work and what, obviously, things have not worked with the way that their incentives are aligned, but do you have any sense of what would be a plausible solution for this?
Well, I mean, one solution would be to kind of break up some of the conflicts of interest which are in there. One of the fascinating things when Greenspan is responsible for a lot of shocking lines, in my view. And one of the amazing ones, recent ones, is when he said, "I'm shocked that there's greed at work in the American capitalist system." That's kind of an amazing remark for a guy who has spent his life believing in the value of greed. So for him to say he's surprised. But the other one is when he was asked about Enron, and Enron went belly up, he said, "I'm shocked that there have been so many problems inside the accounting industry." Because you remember that the accounting industry signed off on the Enron stuff. Well, I found that a shocking comment from him because he was the head of the Federal Reserve at the time that Levitt was running the SEC. And Levitt proposed that the SEC come out with a rule that said that accounting firms may not also do consulting for the firm, get consulting income from the people that they're doing auditing of. And when he proposed that, the accounting industry went berserk, went to Congress and got Mr. Oxley, remember that name? Got Mr. Oxley, who was a champion of the accounting industry in Congress, to fight it back and put pressure on the SEC not to issue that ruling. Well, I mean, Greenspan knew that. The newspapers were full of that controversy, full of that thing. For Greenspan to say that he was not aware that there were conflicts of interest in the accounting industry is really, not credible, Mr. Greenspan. So I think that there are bunches of ways that we could try to deal with the conflicts of interest and think more seriously about that. I mean, I think one of the regulatory things that's happened in a whole lot of issue areas is waving away the conflict of interest ideas and saying, okay, it's okay, get rid of what's it called, get rid of Glass-Steagall, allow a fusion of these things. I mean, a lot of this was an attitude that we did not have a problem to worry about, that larger and flexible would make for more efficiency, which has a lot of truth to it, but that meant that we did not have to worry about the conflicts of interest that could engender. And there were plenty of people in the legal community and elsewhere who were worried about that and writing about that. So that's one way to go, is to be a little bit more concerned about conflicts of interest that arise out of having no sense whatsoever that people doing A are undermining their credibility if they're also doing B.
Jim?
Just a suggestion about some possible research avenues was, you mentioned earlier a concern, which I think is a legitimate concern, about who owns these organizations, whether for-profit or not, what their profit motives are. There's two instances recently that come to my mind that I think would be kind of interesting parallels to see what's happened. And I feel a little bit of a victim of one of them. Maybe that's why I'm asking this question. The most recent one was the group of institutions belong to a group called ISS, who advises them on how to vote in proxies.
Yeah.
And they then become acquired by a for-profit group called Riskmetrics.
Oh, ISS was bought by Riskmetrics, yes.
Yeah, and
right.
Arthur Levitt, by the way, is on the board of Riskmetrics.
Uh-huh.
So be interesting to see what their profit motives are. I suggest that they've changed from my own personal experiences. So,
you think that ISS has behaved since Riskmetrics acquired it?
I think ISS had, well, from a very narrow perspective, I used to have no problems getting data from ISS. And now I give a pint of blood every time I want to try to get something.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah, because it changed.
Is ISS what Nell Minow will help create? Is that what that was? Oh, that's corporate library.
Whether she was there and then she went up and started the corporate library or not, I don't know.
Right. But that's an interesting question. I mean, organizations like ISS are very interesting. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
And the other part of that is there used to be a group that was going to compete with ISS called Glass Lewis, which had they provided scathing reports about executive compensation, et cetera. And they got acquired by a China company, maybe Deborah remembers the name of it, Chinese company that was for profit, puts out one of the major dailies there. And one of my very good friends, a mutual friend actually, Lynn Turner, used to work for Glass Turner. Glenn Turner used to work for Glass Lewis and left them because he could see things being squeezed there. And as a result, I think I've noticed less scathing attacks
right.
by Glass Lewis on management purposes, et cetera, and restatements, et cetera, in that era. So both those have gone morphed to starting off as for privately, non-for-profit, and then got acquired for profit, and then changed certain behavior. Could be worth studying.
Oh, I think that's a great idea because it would help one sharpen up in the area of the shareholders to show how that's played here. If private bonding is so great, as the Chicago people tell us, then how come that we don't have enough private bonding mechanisms in the shareholder world of shareholder services that we can use they could be our agents in monitoring managers, and I don't think we have very good ones. And that's why I'm so fascinated by institutional investors, because the right ones have an incentive, but the shareholder services seem terribly fragmented and vulnerable to this problem.
There's only one other group that I'm really aware of that advises institutions, and it's the Council for Institutional Investors, CII. And they remain sort of independent at this point. It remains to be seen whether they get acquired along the way. And it'd be kind of interesting to see if they become at odds on anything from ISS, although they anyway.
No, I think that would be a very interesting section of this, as to what is it about in the shareholder services world, the profit, and seeing ones that were nonprofit go for profit, how did that change things? Yeah, good.
Sue?
So you asked what gives me confidence.
Yeah, what gives you
in
confidence?
products, and when
See,
it
look at
comes
that
to-
nice meal she just ate. Why do you have, is it because it's Duke? I don't know. Why do you have confidence in that?
Yeah, certainly when it comes to information, which is the product that the NGOs are trying to sell me,
Right.
a large part of it is their own, not just their own independence from the targets, but also whether they're partisan, whether they have a specific agenda. So, is monitoring the means or an end, and if it's an end, like perhaps Consumer Reports or UL, when they just want to give you the information, like when they want to ensure the product is safe, then I tend to give it more credence rather than if it's a
Yes.
means to,
Right.
achieving a certain end, then I'm a little bit worried about, well, are they
Right.
cherry picking?
No, it's a good
certain
point you made. So
information?
your point is if the NGO is an advocacy group,
So if it's like the
Right.
Earth Liberation Front or even PETA, for example, sending out a report, then
Right.
I'm
Right.
probably less, I mean,
Right.
I would still look at
Right.
the information, but then
Right.
I'm gonna discount it a
right,
little
no,
bit.
it's an interesting point about how would we classify, how would we know? This gets back to what's an NGO and at what point. So an NGO, which is an advocate, is not a reliable instrument or confidence builder if it's also a verifier. There's a nice book on labor standards by Elliott and Freeman, labor economist at Harvard, in which he talks about labor standards. And he makes a distinction between vigilantes and verifiers. Vigilantes are the ones who yell that child labor is being, and verifiers are the ones who test. And I find it interesting, I talk to my students because I tell them that you want to work in this area, figure out what personality you are. Are you a vigilante personality or a verifier personality? Because those are different. Are you going to climb up a tree and, are you going to hug a tree, or are you going to go out there careful? So that's an interesting thing for them to figure out in their job searching area, but it's useful for us because, this has generated in that world some of these third-party organizations. So FlowCert, this organization in coffee, really got generated out of the anxiety that you're talking about, because the transfer, the various coffee, those are advocate organizations in some way. They're out there championing the cause of the poor farmers and redistribution to the world, and they started to realize that they needed a verifier of all this that wasn't them, that was independent from them. So I think that is an important, it's certainly an important distinction. It doesn't necessarily, the problem I'd ask you is how would you know? What are you going to do if you see an organization, you've had your lunch or you're about to have your lunch, and you want to know whether it's reliable, and you saw a name, how would you know whether that was an advocate or not?
Well, so actually that leads to the second part of my question, which is, you talk about that there isn't really, that you're moving away from the government regulation side, partly because we're afraid of capture there as well, but
I'm
what
not,
if-
the NGO people
I'm sorry,
are.
the NGO people, which, it makes me wonder, well, what if we had certain regulations on NGOs on what kind of information they need to disclose, wouldn't that overcome the advocacy question
Right.
a little bit? Or are they just so distrusting government that they don't want to be regulated?
They don't want to be regulated, right? It's like the food additive world. The shocker that your drugs are regulated heavily, but you can go down to the local health food store and buy any crap, and they don't have to verify that the echinacea does any good for you. But not only that, they don't even have to verify that what's in that bottle really is echinacea. They are so unregulated. They've been so successful at finding that off in the lobby. So I think the NGO world would not like it, and I don't know that I would like it, or I would be very cautious about it in the sense that what I would demand of them is a certain kind of transparency of reporting. They have to publish their tax returns and all that. But I would be averse to that. I don't know that we could succeed, and I'm not confident enough the regulation of NGOs, other than the way you would regulate anybody who incorporates. I'd like more transparency about all organizations, but I'm not sure I would tell them exactly. I don't know. I don't want to tell them who's on their board or things like that. I would be worried about that. No, I think the interesting trap in this literature, though, is on the issue of government regulation. This is where the labor people are. If any of you are interested in this, I put them up because the literature on labor and the labor standards thing strikes me as the most well-developed on these NGO ethical consumption standards. And I'm assuming because it's the one with the highest voltage and temperature and people who really care. But there's a lot of extensive study, and the people who work on this have come to the conclusion that they have very low confidence in the ability of NGOs adequately to monitor what's actually going on in labor standards around the world because it's so easy to escape and evade. And so what they've come to the conclusion of, we need more regulation. Now I find it really very fascinating because the NGOs have arisen precisely because there wasn't any. So why is calling for more, isn't this back to the very political problem that we have? But to something they believe that they're trying to educate the NGOs. They're trying to get a world where the NGOs become themselves advocates for more regulation. Because they're saying that, one interesting paper is a guy who's doing labor, these guys I know who are writing on labor inspectors in Central America. And really quite fascinating on what's the role of a labor inspector in a civil law country and some of their powers and how that allows them to actually wander around and engage in negotiation, about how to comply. But I think that it's leading down that path, It's leading us down, I think, of an appreciation in the people who specialize in this world that there are limits to what you can do without regulation. So the question for you is, do you want to regulate the NGO or do you want to identify what the limits on NGO monitoring are and get the NGOs to say, we could do a better job if the government had clearer standards of the following kind. If it had more labor inspectors, if it demanded more information from the firm about its practices, we could then do a better job monitoring them as NGOs. That would be one way. I think this is a fascinating area and kind of public-private boundary. What's the division of labor? What could we ask the state to do that could allow the private sector, including NGOs, to do a better job?
Jeff.
Yeah, we're all so excited about a forthcoming book here that I'm, like Professor Cox, going to add another suggestion, something I'd like to hear more about.
What forthcoming book? Your forthcoming?
No, yours.
Oh,
yeah.
my forthcoming.
Yeah. And this actually has to do with the kind of state, private, or NGO divide. It seemed like there's at least two most basic choices. Who's going to monitor, and then once the monitor is chosen, how do we have confidence in that monitor? And this, I think, is directly related to the first one, and I suspect it's related to the second. But I was wondering about elasticity of demand and how that particularly makes us choose the first. And then I think like I said, it relates to the second. I was thinking about like Exxon. I don't consider them the most environmentally or socially responsible organization from everything I've heard as a consumer. I was around and lived in the Northwest during the Exxon Valdez spill. I've heard about building Cameroonian pipelines and deforestation and displacement of the Baka pygmies and all these things that are horrendous. Yet I tend to go there. It's a gas station closest to the where I live. But yet I'll drive a couple miles out of my way to the Durham Co-op to get coffee spending Exxon, paying for Exxon gas the whole way there, because it's certified in a certain way back. And I'm thinking, well, clearly there's a difference in elasticity of demand here between my gasoline, and I'm wondering in the spaces where
I think it's actually because you have such a low opinion of the ability of any gas company to be plausible that you think they're all equally bad, so you're just going to buy the convenient one. Or for some reason you've persuaded yourself in the world of coffee that you could actually make a difference. And I mean, to me, all the oil companies, oil is, I think it's Exxon who has such a terrible environmental reputation. I get confused which is which, but they apparently, and who's the one who has BP? Are they the one? So, BP has a great environmental reputation, but BP has much worse labor safety records than Exxon. Exxon has excellent labor safety records. BP has bad ones. So whose gas are you going to buy? I actually care more about labor safety and a worker not getting killed, so I'm going to start buying Exxon. So feel okay. So Exxon's okay. Exxon's fine. No, but seriously, I'd say elasticity, it's a function of what you care about and what can make a difference. I mean, I think the consumer thing is really fascinating because in this world, Walmart is a tremendously interesting case because the people in this world have been tearing their hair out for years about what to do about Walmart because Walmart's consumers really do care about price. And so you really see that the pressure on firms is powerfully a function of what kind of consumer boycott or other forms of pressure you can put on them, and that's affected by who buys there. Most of the people who buy at Walmart can't afford to worry about, is that detergent really environmentally safe? They don't worry about that so much. So getting at Walmart's been very hard to do. And so what they did against Walmart was to cut 1,000 cuts, go after them in 15 different ways, cause them a lot of trouble, and that started to work. So what Walmart's very fascinating counter-response has been, I could say, to co-opt all the critics. That's why this Conservation International McDonald's thing is very fascinating. The firms in this area, including Starbucks, by the way, Starbucks has been advertising that they have organic Fairtrade coffee, but walk into a Starbucks and try to find it. They now advocating their own standard because they don't want fair trade. They don't want fair trade to become the Intel Inside. I mean, why did Intel market Intel Inside? Because they wanted Intel to be what you wanted and not the brand name of the computer. They didn't want consumer attachment to the computer brand name. They wanted it to their chip. So Starbucks doesn't want you looking for fair trade, which you get different places. They want you to buy Starbucks. So they're not pushing Starbucks anymore, fair trade. They're pushing Starbucks cafe standards. So there's a lot. So what Walmart did was fought back by inviting all of their critics to join various organizations, boards, associations. We've had this dialogue. They've invited to Arkansas. So we're going to go to China and import organic broccoli. Well, of course, in the organic world, that's, oh my God, if all that broccoli comes organic, it'll increase the organic market. Or we're going to have what I call Al Gore light bulbs. We're going to have. So if they do that, the market effect is so enormous that this mesmerizes the socially concerned world. And the criticism has fallen off. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. It's not elasticity, I think. It has to do with the structure of consumer preferences, what you care about, and how you differentiate amongst different producers. But it's hugely important understanding the nature of the pressure upon firms is intimately connected to the consumer thing. So I have a colleague who's doing a test on, what will consumers pay for social standards. And he's doing it, actually, I think, a lot of people who do that research do questionnaires. That, I say, is a very low reliability. You ask me, are you going to pay more for a product? And I will say yes, but will I really do it? So he's actually doing real marketing. He's gotten various companies to allow him to put in their stores or on Amazon coffee at different prices and then seeing what happens. How high a premium does he have to add? So from a method point of view, that's much more reliable, I think, than surveys. Sorry.
Carla.
So your paper sort of constructs a framework for monitoring the monitoring organizations, and I was wondering how the discussion between in the coffee world, the discussion between Fairtrade looking at helping poor farmers versus I don't know how to
I just say Utz.
looking at
Utz but I don't know where that.
looking at landless laborers.
Yes.
I was wondering how, like, looking at those differences, how that factors into the framework for monitoring the monitoring organization. Like, what
It
is that
doesn't.
indicator?
No, it doesn't at all. It does nothing to tell you the difference. It does nothing to tell you whether one is more reliable or another. It's only telling you that in the world of competing standards, that one of the confusions in this world to you as a consumer is that you're trying to figure out what label is reliable for you. But it can be confusing to you because you've got competing labels out there which actually are measuring different things. So it's not telling us anything, as you're saying, about which of those two organizations is reliable. It's only addressing the question about, one of the debates in the literature is, does competition amongst NGOs drive standards up or down? Does it increase or decrease your ability to have confidence? And this, to me, was an example of where it can be confusing because these are rival standards, not rival efficacy of monitoring. But you're absolutely right. It's not a paired comparison the way the other ones are about claiming to give you the same standard. Now, yeah. I mean, that's a tough methodological thing because really being certain that they're really giving you exactly the same standard is a toughie because FLA and WRC don't really give you the same standard either. Because what would qualify, if you burr down the details, what FLA would consider an adequate level of safety turns out not to be the same either. Even if the same criteria, I mean, Utz is a very interesting one because of the problem of do we care about landless laborers? But it comes down to what's healthy, you know, how clean does the air have to be, how many, you know, what age is the child, stuff like that. And it's an interesting one because from an organizational dynamic point of view, if organizations try to do a good job, they get internal dynamics. So the people running the Fair Labor Group understand that they have to worry about coffee that's made with laborers. And so they want to, the guys running it that I've talked to, they want to issue regulations, but their members won't let them because their members think that they're an association of small producers. And the people hiring the laborers are the guys they hate. They're the big estate owners. So if they think the FLA, a fair trade label is going to appear on something that an estate owner is doing, they think that's death. That's going to allow them to compete. So it becomes a problem that enters into monitoring. In that way, it's a problem for us as consumers of these labels. How do we know which one to pick? But it becomes part of the organizational dynamics. I mean, I find it interesting to think about these NGOs as organization with survival requirements. What do they have to do? They have a bunch of constituencies they have to please. So Fairtrade, one of its constituencies are these producers it's supposed to be helping. Well, who's the agent, who's the principal here? Are they supposed to be helping us who buy the coffee? Or is it these small producers that they claim they came into existence to help? Well, what's the status of those producers in the decision-making of the organization? Murky, because there's no membership in that. So.
Yes, it's related with the private bonding context. Yeah. Do you think that the UL example is applicable to bond rating agencies? And doing a parallel,
why do you think it's not?
Because I was thinking.
Throw the question back.
Yeah, I was thinking in looking for example, the institutional investors are as like the fire insurance companies today. Because they want to reduce the risk.
Right.
Not the issuers. The issuers want to raise money.
Yeah.
At level, I mean.
No, I agree with you. I would throw but the people who should be paying for the bond rating are not the firm, which has every incentive to fool you. But it should be, if you're an institution that's offering a pension fund, and you're under a regulation that pension fund should only have AAA bonds, why aren't you paying? You should be the one who's paying for it, and build that into the price of the bond that you, the purchaser of the bond, pay, so that it's being done by the pension fund that's trying to attract your business. Pension fund says, I'm great, I'm only in AAA. Well, did you pay for that AAA? No, you didn't, actually.
Exactly. So, and
So in that
if-
sense, I think it is analogous. Yeah.
if you design a system that, for example, a mix, I mean, I think that the conflict of interest, it comes from the source of payment, the issuers. So if you design
All right, absolutely. So apropos of that, what did you all think of the discussion about is a fee and a profit any different? And I'm very torn up about that. We have a lot of organizations out there who aren't for-profit organizations, but they charge a fee for their service. Well, it seems to me they're an organization, they have a payroll to meet, they have employees, they have executives who get a salary, they have all kinds of interests in getting, I mean, any number of organizations that depend for their survival and their welfare upon earning those fees. This is election monitors, all these things. So they would be in a terrible shape if people left and start paying the fee. So I'm not so sure that fee paying versus profit making really is sufficient to drive a different dynamic. I'm not sure I understand. I don't quite see that. And just an example, I was interviewing the head of Transfer USA, who's the coffee guy, and he kind of wistfully said, he's quite a remarkable guy. He's inspiring. He's actually an excellent example of why the NGO world does so well at persuading you that their virtue as people and in motive makes them virtuous and that you stop paying careful attention. So this is a guy who was a graduate student and went to Nicaragua 30 years ago and got terribly, as a sociologist, studied the sociology of small, poor coffee producers. And he was so fascinated and moved by their plight that he created these producer associations and then helped create Transfer. He's one of the people who helped create this thing to help them. But I cannot get him to be transparent. He won't share information at all. If you ask him questions about how they work, he'll say, well, look, what a great job we're doing. And it's hard to, but then he wistfully said, I wonder sometimes whether we should be a profit-making organization. And I found that really interesting. I said, why are you interested in that? He says, well, for one reason, it's extremely difficult to raise the money. In order to do what we're doing, they're trying to branch out and do bananas, which they are doing. They're trying to go on to other tropical world products. But this is so difficult. Monitoring is expensive. In order to do a good job monitoring, we need money. Where are we going to get the money? We have to chase after foundations all the time and get people to donors because the fees that we're charging aren't enough to pay for all this. So if we had a business plan, we could do this. And of course, yes, he could, but he would run into other problems by doing that.
Yeah, but do you think that, for example, taxpayer will be happy to contribute to a fund together with investors and rather than spend their money in bailouts programs? I mean, looking for good rating?
No, because taxpayers are the mentality that I want it, but I don't have to pay for it. That is the fundamental kind of political economy problem of our society. Yes, I want to, but if you want me to pay a tax for it, I don't have to pay. They should do it because that's their duty.
Okay, now, there is a class that is very eager to get what they're paid for, and there are many more questions for Professor Gourevitch. So let's have a round of applause.
Thank you.